Well, welcome everyone to this episode of Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by the superb Barnali Ghosh and Anirvan Chatterjee. Thank you so much, you both, for being here.
Thanks for having us.
I'm always so curious about firsts, and I'm wondering if you both remember the very first tour that you gave, but particularly how you felt after it was done.
Yeah, you want to start?
Yeah, so I work with a project called Bay Area Solidarity Summer, and that's the training project for emerging young South Asian American activists and organizers. So we were running a tour as part of the history curriculum for this group of young activists, and they were super diverse. I mean, they were folks from like Pakistan and India and Sri Lanka. They were mostly from California, but kind of all over. They had different issues they were working on, like climate change. This is 12 years ago, like anti-Islamophobia, just a lot of different things. And for us, there's a thing where a lot of our history, we are told that it's always back in the homeland. We always have to look 10,000 miles away to like know where we came from. And there is so much South Asian American history, so many stories just like on the streets we walk on.
Yeah.
And we know this just from like being like not 15 or 20 years old.
Right.
And living in Berkeley, and I've been living in Berkeley since the 1990s. I mean, we could be doing this tour anywhere. We just happened to live in Berkeley. It was really important for us to kind of get across to a lot of the young activists of like, you don't have to invent this. We have, in the same way that, yes, we have a tradition of arts, we have a tradition of music, for better or for worse, we have a tradition of certain kinds of professions, of those who immigrated here first. We can actually tell a much larger story of who we are through story. And that meant that we were able to tell stories of anti-colonial activists who were like living and running around in Berkeley 100 years ago. We were able to tell stories of post 9/11 solidarity. We were able to tell stories of like Black and brown standing together. And for some of these young people, I mean, it was just like world changing to know that their world was a little bit bigger than like the version of South Asia that their parents had told them.
Yeah.
And half a block from where the camp was happening is where we started the tour. So they are in this historical place, but most of us walk by these buildings, walk by these spots without even knowing. So I think for us, it's interesting that you asked, how did it make you feel? Because for us, it's always been about leaving anybody who comes on the tour with a feeling of belonging, with the feeling of this city is yours, this place is yours, you have roots here. We've had ancestors who fought for us to be here. You can be part of this. These are stories of everyday people. So I think that was our intention going in, was to leave those young folks empowered and with a sense of belonging. And that's, yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a power to having done this for 12 years, and you can reflect on that for sure. Yeah. Were you surprised by how you felt after that very first tour? And the reason I ask that is because I wonder if there was that same exact sense of not just what you accomplished, but the questions it raised after that very first tour. I mean, especially as a motivator, like even accelerating further tours.
So I think for us, going in, I personally was quite nervous doing it for young people because, young people, they will tell you exactly what they think of you and what they think of what you're sharing.
No filter.
Yeah, you have to be authentic and truthful, and you have to share it with integrity, right? Yeah. Which is what we were doing, but you still don't know what they might be seeing that we're not seeing.
Sure.
But their feedback, and we always do this, at the end of the tour, we'll ask people to share what their favorite story was. We've been doing that since the first day. A lot of our pedagogy around this is influenced by social justice activists and spaces that we've been part of. And hearing that feedback from them, I think left us feeling moved and feeling like we had hit upon something. And at which point, we were only going to do that tour, right? And then we were like, should we do it for the general public? And at that moment, I was like, no, the young people were great. I'm not sure about doing it for adults. Adults have so much baggage. Will they even be open to hearing the stories like these young folks were? But I think we were affirmed a lot in the decisions that we made of what we shared, how we shared it, and the way we engage them. So honestly, much of our tour has not changed over the 12 years,
right,
except for new information or politics that happens, external factors. We've been able to really stay with a lot of the good things we learned when we did that first tour for young folks. And most importantly, that they left feeling something,
right,
and it wasn't just a barrage of facts, which they can look up, honestly.
And so many of those young people from that first tour, they're doing the work here and now. They're young organizers. There are folks who are doing Palestine solidarity work. Some of the founders of the South Asian Legal Defense Fund, they were on that walking tour 12 years ago.
Mm.
And just the idea that as a young person to know that, like, yes, social change movements are part of our heritage.
Yeah.
And to see them out in the world doing that work.
There's an element of youth becoming transformed and youth being galvanized by and inspired. And there's also an element of other generations, in fact, transforming themselves and seeing a different vantage point, and, or for that matter, unwinding or unspooling some of the either history or for that matter, even, kind of myths or trauma that they've gone through as well.
Absolutely.
Have you had some of those aha moments, especially in reflecting back, where, yes, there are some people who've gone on to do some amazing, great things, and then there's other people who report, wow, this is something that completely blew my mind about all that I have already had to, sort of learn.
Yeah. I think the two specific moments that come up for me, and it might be something different for you, but I think the one moment was when a friend of ours who's queer, who's lesbian, she was on the tour with us that day with another member of her family. And she was already out in the community, but she said this was the first time she in the end, when we go around and do the sharing, she shared that she's part of the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
And she said she had never felt safe to do that in a group of strangers. And I felt really honored and proud that we've been able to create that space, and the way we told the stories for somebody to be able to claim that identity.
Sure.
We also had another friend who shared an experience she had post 9/11 when she was at the gas station with her mother. They were going to a Dandi or a Garba. It was that season, September, and then September, October.
Yeah.
And she said that when she got there, this is in Southern California actually, to the gas station, her mom got out and she said, no, get in, we have to leave. And that was not a story that she had shared with her partner or with her kids up to that moment.
Yeah.
Because again, what you're saying, people have these traumas that they hide. They don't know always if anybody else is going through it, but also we don't have those spaces where it's okay to share that.
Yeah.
So those are the two that really stick out for me, but there have been many moments like that. I think even for people who've been part of movements, like when we started, we thought this would be more for the general public, but all our friends who are activists and organizers started coming.
Yeah.
They started bringing their family, because who can explain to their family what they do?
Right.
Often you cannot, but we
It's
can.
an instant peer group.
Right. So we can do that.
Yeah.
And then you can have the conversation.
Yeah.
But most importantly, even they needed a grounding in history, because as South Asians, we often enter activist spaces and we're seen as allies.
Yeah.
So there is not always an understanding of the work our community's done or the specific issues that our community faces. Part of that is because of, the model minority. I can talk more about that, but we're seen as privileged across the board. We're seen as not having issues of discrimination across the board.
Yeah.
And though many of our stories are about solidarity between communities, it's also specific to our community.
Yeah, no, there's a sharing of identities that naturally happens, and again, there's with great specificity comes actually a lot of universality, and I'm curious in that same way of thinking about the model minority piece, why is it that the Desi American or South Asian American history is catches people as a secret?
I mean, somebody lands. So you get off a plane. Nobody gives you like an ethnic studies textbook,
right?
how would you know? Like somebody arrives in 2010, how would you know what happened in 1910?
Yeah.
And I think that's been a really big challenge where maybe there's the oldest member of your community in your friend group that you talk to. Maybe they know something that happened like 10 or 20 years before. And a lot of our work is actually providing a little bit more context to where we came from, what our stories have been. And sometimes that means things like we tell stories of the Ghadar Party, and the Ghadar Party just being here in the Bay and on the West Coast in the 1910s. Just the idea that there were like freedom fighters running around, and like, no, not in South Asia. They're like literally here. And they're organizing in San Francisco and elsewhere to like overthrow the empire. And that is part of history nobody tells you. And for a 16-year-old,
you're not thinking, you're not hearing the direct link to Bhagat Singh.
Exactly.
You know,
So I think that's like a really important piece, because like we had no plaques. It's not in the history textbook. Your kids are not growing up hearing that in the schools. So people will come on in our case to a history event because it's one of the very few places where they can actually like access that history. And the other piece of that is for a lot of kind of post-1965 immigrants. I mean, they're coming here to some extent as professional, skilled STEM workers, at least for the first wave. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, this is a post-Cold War context. The U.S. needed STEM workers to be able to come in. The economy here needed it. Countries like India, for example, were overproducing STEM workers. And so there's all these like push and pull factors. So it's this like weird founder effect where some of the first people here post-65, suddenly that's like setting up the stereotype for the whole community. And now with family-based migration and before and after, like it just overshadows all the different things that people do. We're so much more interesting than we think, but you don't know that.
And those conversations don't exist at the, kitchen table, and you have a lot of, mobility, so to speak, among families. And, I imagine at Berkeley, again, you happen to do this in Berkeley, but I'm imagining that, of course, this exact same interrogation could happen just about anywhere. In fact, it probably should be happening more in rural America and in other spaces where it doesn't. When you both are thinking of the work you do and how it evolves, are you both community historians and activists, or are you specifically South Asian community historians and activists?
Don't get us into trouble. No.
Well, I mean,
we are community historians and activists. I think we're not South Asian community historians, just because I think there is a politics to, we do call it the Berkeley South Asian Radical History Walking Tour, but Anirvan and I also own Berkeley History.org, because for decades people have done a history of a place that's told only the history of white people. And it's been okay to just call it the history of that place. So there is a power in defining the tour as South Asian, because we want it first and foremost to be for our people to understand who they are. But also we don't feel like we need to put ourselves in that box. We're fine doing just South Asian history and being just community historians. Because of the politics of how it's been used.
And we're always excited to kind of make connections. Like we'll talk about India and Irish solidarity against the British Empire. In like 100 years ago, we'll talk about Black and Brown solidarity. It's like
Punjabi Mexican solidarity.
Exactly. Bengali Harlem. It's not like we can't tell our stories without telling a lot of other stories along the way.
That are naturally connected.
We've never been separate.
And I wonder if even that, again, it's amazing to, in fact, reflect upon that, because it can be different from the first time when you develop this to like the many iterations and practices that you have to go through with that too. I'm thinking of, the stories that probably catch people. Those are the ones that seem a little bit more obvious. So whether that's, Kala Bagai or Kartar Singh, Saurabha, even Jayaprakash Narayan, the founding of Trikorn, this dozens of others, I'm sure. When you think about all those sort of touch points, does the power of these stories then subsequently reside in the audiences that you have in the sort of greater South Asian American community to amplify? Or is the power in the American zeitgeist at large to sort of recognize and integrate it better. I'm kind of asking a very Zen-esque historical question, but how do you think about that? Like, is the method here geared towards a specific audience, right? Like, I mean, how do you, in a way, almost market this?
Yeah, I'll say it's both, right?
Yeah.
I think for me, it's both.
Right.
And then it also depends on the story and on the audience.
Sure.
But I'll say, at least for the Kala Bagai Way campaign, that was a South Asian person story. So there's definitely an aspect of representation because Berkeley is 20% Asian American, yet there are no streets or official buildings. There are some on campus that are named after an Asian American person, especially an historical Asian American person. So for us, it is about representation, but it doesn't stop there because usually how cities name streets, you have to actually have lived in the city, whereas Kala's story is all about being turned away from the city, right? Yeah. So we took a lot of risk with changing the paradigm on how cities name people. You become famous, then the city wants to name something after you, right? Sure. And in this case, we were asking Berkeley to reconcile a difficult history, to accept that there are people who come to our city now. We're a sanctuary city who don't build enough housing. So it's all the history that we share is connected to the present. That affects more communities than just South Asians.
Sure.
So when you're the first, you are a symbol, but that is never our goal to just remain a symbol. And as part of the campaign, we brought together many different kinds of folks as well. So our stories can be relevant to folks who are not just part of our community. So that's when we are becoming part of the bigger narrative and understanding how it specifically might affect South Asians, but in many cases, other people can connect to Kala's story for different reasons. Like we worked with Indigenous folks, we worked with other Asian American communities, with housing activists. It's not like just South Asians or Asian American folks have to fight for the street name. Also the location of the name, it's right in downtown Berkeley. Yeah. Many times when you have street names like this, you're excluded into a Chinatown. You've made it a place for your community. Right. We'll give you a street name. Yeah. There might be a street leading to the Gurdwara that's called Gurdwara Way. But to just have it be a normal part of your city where people are, hey, we should pedestrianize Kala Bagai Way. It's just regular part of the conversation. Yeah. People walk by it all the time. It's near the BART station. I think that's the aspect of integrating it into the American fabric and not just how it affects South Asians. But of course, being seen as integrated into the American fabric while maintaining your identity and history, that has power. And I think for too long, folks who came before us, that was a struggle for them for many reasons. You want to add something?
Yeah, one of the parts of the Kala Bagai Way campaign that really moved me was the very first op-ed in favor of Kala Bagai Way. It didn't come from South Asians, it didn't come from Asian Americans, it came from a group of pro-housing activists in the city of Berkeley. Yeah. Most of whom were not South Asian at all. And for them, just that clear connection between we need to make space in the city for newcomers and being able to name a downtown street after somebody who's turned away from the city. Right. It's a direct one-to-one thing of like, it's not like pro-housing way, but like it's using a real person story. And I think that's kind of the point where we want to be specific around like, yes, we tell Kala Bagai's story, but it's part of a much larger narrative and it shouldn't be limited only to our community.
I wonder if that specificity and power of that very individual story requires coalition building at some point to, kind of penetrate into the narratives that are out there. And also for that matter, for it to have some kind of longevity as well. Right. Because if it was specifically, again, like Gurdwara Way or something like that, then, it sort of is, there's a cul-de-sac there, literally and figuratively that, can't go anywhere. And in that coalition building that you both are building, I definitely want to ask particularly Barnali this, has this kind of thread of activism and the idea that you have power that goes beyond yourself, and you can be both specific and build coalitions. Has that always been kind of baked into your temperament, your general nature? And especially now as you're running for public office, right? I mean, did you need to practice this first before sort of crossing a precipice to, creating a tour, running for office, things like that?
I'd say for me, well, let me just pause and think about it. I think it was very clear to me that it needed to be a coalition. But also, as we share these stories and the stories transform people, they also transform you.
Right, of course.
So you also learn from the things you're telling people that these people did.
Yeah.
And what kind of organizing and activism feels effective, what feels the right way to approach an issue like this. So when we were going to do this, of course, it was going to be through coalition building, because both of us, know the problems with it just being about representation. That only takes you so far. And this is something we've talked about. This is something we talked about on the tour. But I think I have also been doing work in the city for a long time. I've been on the Transportation Commission for 10 years. I'm the vice chair of the Planning Commission. I also understand the process of how things get done and how decisions get made.
Yeah.
This is not always something that folks in our community, especially activist folks, are wanting to be on the other side of. Like, you're not often wanting to be at the table because it's a hard place.
Yeah.
It's much nicer to be on the other side, and
And
nicer. It feels better.
Yeah. But did you grow up that way as well? Or was this a transformation that you felt particularly in immigrating?
Yeah, I mean, definitely a transformation.
Yeah.
But I think the reason I craved it and hungered for it is because I didn't find a sense of belonging when I moved to the city of Berkeley. I had an expectation that I was coming to this place that was a home of the free speech movement, that was progressive, and yet I went to, as a landscape architect, went to many community meetings all over California, where people would say you had to have lived here a certain number of years for you to have an opinion, as if our journey as an immigrant, our experience in our homelands has no impact on what we bring and what we contribute.
They're relatively discounted.
Right. Yeah. So I think that really sort of made me angry.
Yeah.
And also I felt like if I had to belong here, and belonging is such a powerful tool. That's the only way I think you can change a place. You have to feel like you are invested in the well-being of a place, right?
Yeah.
And if that's your home, how do you do that if everybody else around you is making you feel like you don't belong?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think I took that to heart, that if nobody else was going to do this, then I was going to have to do it for myself. And so for me, this power of belonging through doing the tour and Kala Bagai way, it's selfish. It's very personal.
Right.
That's what's empowered me to run for office. Having gone through that experience. And hopefully there are other people who don't need that. We're totally fine. But I needed that, and I think I meet a lot of people on the walking tour who also need that. And if you're going to be running for something in a place that is not primarily South Asian, you have to build those coalitions. You have to be aware of the issues that people in other communities are facing. What it does is attunes you to looking for the leaders and the people in those communities.
Yeah.
And what those issues are. You are more attuned to that because you know what it's like for your community.
Your lens is perhaps looking for that in different ways, and your experiences have now almost kind of curated it so that your walking tour is activism in life, so to speak, right? Let me ask a slightly different question for activism in a slightly different way, where it's not necessarily public office, but it's a lot of interrogation of intersections. And for you, Anirvan, you've explored and done some really, just amazing interrogation, particularly of the intersection of Black America and the South Asian American or even the Indian American experience. And of course, right now, the most visible embodiment of that is Vice President Harris. And I know that some of this comes up on the tour, especially as well. But in examining this, what lessons should Americans take away from this very, very deep and complex relationship that goes well beyond what the surface story is of Vice President Harris and even MLK and Gandhi and all that. But if one were to explore and interrogate it to the degree that you have, what are some of the lessons that they particularly should take away from the lens of representation and activism?
A lot of times when people come to the US, and this is something, Barnali, that you talk about, growing up in India, when you looked at like American movies that made their way to India, it's like the US is like, it's a white country. Like when somebody says, oh, like I'm something or the other with the Americans, like we know exactly which Americans.
Right.
And one of the things that's been...
That's at 65.
Yeah.
I mean, we chuckle at that, and yet, like, the truth is that that's exactly right. And it's definitely, impressions from afar are very much baked into people's narratives, either when they arrive or, for that matter, even passed along to the next generations.
And nobody tells you when you arrive that white America didn't want us when we were here. Just the idea that pre-1923, where citizenship was so tenuous, it's 1923, and every single Indian American, no matter whether like you can go and argue to people, you can argue to a judge that I'm kind of white, I'm honorary white, look at my caste, look at my Indo-European languages, they don't care. And certain local judges gave people citizenship. But then in 1923, Bhagat Singh Thind case, the Supreme Court was like, no, we don't believe you. You're not white. You are literally not white. An entire ethnic group was stripped of our citizenship. And it was the first time in American history that there was this like mass denaturalization of an entire ethnic group. And nobody tells you that the day you get off a plane, that aspiration to whiteness, that it's so tenuous. And maybe that's not the best strategy to become American. And it changed. I mean, we, in 1946, up to 100 people from, let's say, India were allowed to become US citizens per year, or to come with kind of that intent. And in 1965, it all changed. And what was happening in the 1960s? I mean, it's all the movements. And there's a couple of different reasons why the 1965 immigration laws changed everything for us. It was a Cold War context, and the US needed more STEM workers, so that's the reason economically why they needed more people from South Asia. Because it's a Cold War, the US was also trying to front in front of like all these third world nations, saying like, are you going to go with the Soviet Union or are you going to go with us? Yeah. And just literally like, we're not going to allow your people, telling people from like Indonesia and India and all, and Egypt and all these other countries, you're not even allowed to come to our country and get citizenship. This is what we think of you. That was an issue. And when folks in Pakistan and India and Indonesia, these countries are looking at the US, they're seeing the way that Black activists were fighting for any kind of basic civil rights equality. And they're like, yeah, we don't believe you. I mean, at least the Soviet Union isn't fronting that way. Yeah. And the US was like, this is embarrassing. Cold War context, like the news coming out of the US is embarrassing. And finally, little by little, Black activists were overthrowing some of the most racist laws in the US. I mean, getting the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the 1965 immigration reforms. Well, that wasn't the primary goal of Black activism of the 60s. It happened in that context. And I don't think South Asian America would exist if it weren't for the really critical role that Black activism played in winning civil rights for everybody, including us, and secondarily, like winning immigration rights for everybody. And citizenship wasn't granted to us. Like, there's this idea that we live in the Bay, we live near Silicon Valley. There's this idea that we are, like, we're awesome, we're so blessed. We, like, the US should be lucky to have us. And yes, absolutely, they should be lucky to have us. Yeah. But nobody saw that until the right for us to even be here was won. As a data scientist, a couple of years ago, I was looking at the 1940 US Census. And I got this data set, and I was trying to figure out, like, what was happening with South Asians in the US. And they didn't always like list people's birthplaces, but then I was like, okay, well, let me look at like really common last names like Khan or Singh. And so I looked specifically at Singh because there were a lot of Sikh folks here at the time, relatively speaking, a huge proportion of the community.
Certainly California.
Yeah. So I took the entire U.S. Census data set. I pulled out every single person with the last name of Singh, and their average age was like in their 40s.
Hmm.
And I'm like late 40s, and I'm like, how is it that like immigrants are on average in the late 40s? You'd think they'd be in their 20s and 30s. And so this is like a data thing. Like I'm sitting there with like Excel and JSON files and all that,
Right.
and I'm doing my digital humanities work, but suddenly it's like, oh, they didn't allow us to be here.
Yeah.
So there's this group of aging single men who are here, and they're aging in place. There are no women here.
Right.
And it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And seeing that data, and then suddenly Black activists in the 60s open up the floodgates for us. If we knew that, I think we would walk through race a little bit differently. We would look at moments like Black Lives Matter a little bit differently. We would look at the story of Kamala Harris a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
Of just knowing how important that is, and the stories that are kind of behind. For a lot of people, she just kind of appeared out of nowhere. Maybe not so much in the Bay.
Yeah.
But
you
have
know,
context.
And with that, you weave this story with data and thinking about the questions that it brings up. And now when you think about that narrative from the 40s, connect the dots to the 60s, think about all the different movements that have both transcended and transpired since then. And now in 2024, where we have people that are marginalized in a lot of different corners of society, when we think about specifically that intersection of Black America and South Asian Americans, are there particular questions that people should be asking related back to this kind of complexity that you talk about? And that goes beyond just the like, hey, she's someone who represents both of these, sort of segments of society, because that's the baseline, and that's the easy way to explore that. Yeah. But there's a second, there's a third, there's a fourth question that perhaps should be asked.
I think I'll take that a little bit. I think I'd say personally, I've been very excited.
Yeah.
For VP Harris, and part of it is seeing somebody who is biracial.
Yeah.
There are so many other things to be excited about.
Sure.
I think, the fact that it's a biracial person, that also complicates identity and representation by itself. Seeing somebody who hasn't had biological children, I never thought that would be somebody who's,
right.
Every other president has not. Let's say that. Has not had biological delivered biological.
You're correct, yes.
You know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I find that really amazing and empowering to sort of see that and to see the conversations happening around that. I think because she's from the Bay, we are much more critical of her record.
Yeah.
As a prosecutor,
sure.
Folks in the Bay, we've always been very pro-Palestine. So, thinking about the administration and what's happening in Israel and genocide. And I'll say personally, I am very much anti-war. So for me, it's like we're sending all this money there and our public transit systems are suffering. Right. So, but I think there is a lot to be excited about.
Sure.
Because she can bridge identities.
Yeah. She
can bridge communities.
Yeah.
If we are able to support her, but also demand better of her, I think there's a lot that can happen. And I also think different people get excited for different things. I think she offers us very different things to be excited about, but there are also things to be sort of critical about, which have nothing to do with her being Black and brown.
Correct.
Right? Which is also an achievement, I would say. I think from a historical perspective, it would be impressive if we as South Asians were able to confront the anti-Black Blackness that we have in our community.
Sure.
Maybe this is that moment, right? Historically, we have been anti-Black, though I think Black Desi Secret History is a great example. The stories that Anirvan has documented there of how you don't have to be. Like we have had folks in the past who have seen each other, seen the struggles of South Asians and Black communities, being able to see each other in our struggles. We are not separate. One struggle isn't necessarily bigger than the other. That's how people have come together, by seeing the commonalities. Solidarity is powerful. Yeah. So that's my expectation of this moment as a South Asian person talking to South Asians. Hey, this is a great time.
Right.
Not just to show support for VP Harris, but also look around in your own community and see what is happening with Black folks in your community. Around policing, around poverty, around housing,
Everything.
around leadership.
Yeah.
This is our opportunity to do better.
I love that concept of excitement generating movements, but at the same time, really kind of piquing interest in the extra interrogation and self-reflection, for that matter, both as individuals and as a community. I'm curious for you both, like, we're talking about this, and there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement, but it has to also feel for you both a little bit like a kind of a self-reflection journey as well. And are there things that either of you had to perhaps unlearn about yourselves dramatically in curating the walking tour, or for that matter, not just curating the walking tour, but really sustaining this activism, and so that it stays within your DNA and it just doesn't sort of fade and sort of dampen with time?
I think our first story that we do, Anirvan, if you want to talk about that a little bit, it's been a story that I think we wrote to keep us inspired.
Right.
So I don't know if you want to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah. So the first story we tell on the tour, it's the story of Tinku Alishtiak, who is somebody from Berkeley, a gay Bangladeshi American activist, and just also like a just really wonderful person and friend. And he is somebody who moved here, studied computer science, got involved in early 1980s gay activism, was one of the early founders of Recounting, got involved with a group called Queers Undermining Israeli Terrorism, doing work in Central America, like a lot of people in Berkeley did in the 1980s.
Doing
a lot of homeland activism and doing a lot of U.S. activism. And he is somebody who went back home to take care of his mother. He is somebody who has navigated doing work with other immigrant Bangladeshis to send money home. And really like a three-dimensional figure.
Yeah.
As like when I look at Tinku, I look at somebody who's like had economic stability and found love and done really critical justice work, has been a caregiver. And we're really proud and to be able to share stories of like rounded, three-dimensional, complicated South Asians where it's not like the activists are over here and the techies are over there or the caregivers are over here. We can
or queer folks only work on queer issues.
Right.
I think that's something that is definitely, I think, Anirvan, you have for a decade now said that you want to be Tinku when you grow up.
Yeah.
And I think for me too, it gives us this sort of permission to be our whole selves.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of young people and even older folks.
And by the way, is that something that you truly had to, in a way, create space for yourself?
I think so.
And that's
absolutely.
Yeah.
Because, we're all, I think, when we think of activism, most people think of protest, right? It's the most visible form of activism.
Sure.
I do not like going to protest. I've always been a little bit of an introvert.
Yeah.
I'm very sensitive to sun and to crowds. One of the reasons I enjoy living in the US is because it's not India where, so for me, going to a protest was a huge, it took a lot of like physical and emotional strength to do that. And I did it, and I had Anirvan's company in doing that and a cohort that I went with. So I'm able to advise people that if you want to go to a protest and you're not comfortable, this is how you have to do it.
Yeah.
But it's a huge leap for me. But I thought that was the only way. And as we've done this tour, a big part of what we do on the tour is in each story, people are doing different things. People are being murdered by the British.
Yeah.
But people are also, like Kala Bagai, doing community building. Like the youth at Berkeley High, doing teach-ins. Like there are other people are writing.
Yeah.
There are so many ways to be part of change.
Right.
And I also thought that the only way to be part of change is to actually be out on the street. And you realize that even those people out on the street, like our friend Deepayar's book about the social change ecosystem talks about all these roles. And we are guilty as organizers of uplifting some roles and not looking at the folks maybe who are from the back, right?
I mean, there's always the photo in the newspaper of the person holding the bullhorn or with their fist up in the air.
Right.
And yes, and there's like 100 people behind them to make that work.
Right.
From people cooking to people doing policy work.
Yeah.
But you need that striking image, but that's not enough.
But we do see a lot of young people struggle to be part of social change while they also are trying to find a job. They're like, are we allowed to work in capitalism while fighting for change? And I think Tinku's story just shows us most of us will probably be lucky to have a lifetime to make change. And you don't have to rush it.
Yeah.
You can
let it marinate. Let it evolve.
marinate. Sometimes it's good to take a step back. Sometimes you have to push yourself because that's the moment where you have to step up. And understanding that is critical.
I love how you use the word sort of like this wonderful 3D person, right? That like they don't always have to be in two separate lanes. You can live in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, different lanes. And on top of that, I think what you're both speaking to is the comfort of your own discomforts, right? And really being at peace with that. I'll get you both out of here on this. For those people who are kind of learning about your work for the very first time now, how do you hope they feel after they experience the walking tour or even see some of your work online, or have been exploring this slice of activism? Like, what do you hope are their very first sort of thoughts when they sort of experience your work for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, organizing happens in organizations, and there's a certain thing that a lot of folks encountering activism for the first time, there's this fear of like, I need to do it by myself. I need to invent this for myself. People just get stuck. And really a lot of our work is like, yeah, this is normal. Like a lot of us have been doing this for generations. Every story we tell is in some way about the collective. It's about people who are learning and doing it together. And really, we want to make this feel really approachable. The social change movements are not like won by heroes. It's won by a lot of people pushing a little bit in a certain direction. Yeah. And if you can kind of just get that across, if we have 30 or 40 or 50 people come on the walking tour and somebody walks into a meeting a week later or a month later, mission accomplished.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's also that people, like I was talking about before, feel a certain kind of rootedness and belonging.
Yeah.
That this is not just something they're doing for others, which is great to be an ally, but that our own communities benefit from it as well, that we have our specific issues, and also that we understand the complexity of our own communities when it comes to class and caste, right? So if you come on the tour, you will walk away not just feeling pride, but it's not just, again, about pride, because so many of the stories are about challenges that we face from our own community members. When Tinku was outed, it was within the Bangladeshi community. We talk about labor trafficking. That's happening within the South Asian community, the Indian community. That brings up issues of caste, right? So again, it is to give you a new lens and a new perspective to look at every situation, to also not have a reaction that is a knee-jerk reaction, to be thoughtful and nuanced, to look for the leaders and the voices that are missing in who's telling you the story. So to develop an intelligence around how social change happens. And I think lastly, to figure out today what your role is going to be in that. Because honestly, social change doesn't happen just by a few people. Lasting social change doesn't happen that way. Yeah. You can have some things change, but lasting social change only happens if we're able to ultimately change everybody's point of view, right? And that takes hard work, and that takes that conversation with neighbors, with families. Right. And there are organizers who are creating those resources. I think there was a letter for Black Lives that was translated into so many languages, right? There's so much power in the tools that we have, in the Marathi that you know, to be able to talk to so many members of our community who honestly, we also leave out of these conversations. Yeah. Much of the Gadar story is about using language tools, using Punjabi and Urdu to talk about the anti-colonial movement, to talk about reaching out to people in suburban areas and in rural areas, not just speaking to people in urban areas. There are so many lessons that we share on this that we hope we leave people with a whole toolkit of ideas and ways to get involved. And the only thing we ask is get involved in something. One thing we didn't touch upon that I would like to end with is we started the tour primarily at that point because we wanted more South Asians to be engaged in climate activism. this is something that affects people here, but also in our homeland. And it's one of those rare issues that if you can work on reducing emissions here, it has a direct impact. Like no other issue has that kind of direct scientific impact.
Correct.
So our goal was, as South Asians here, living in a country that has historically one of the highest emissions, while seeing folks in India, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, and in Nepal suffer right now and for decades now, these direct impacts. We have a lot of power. The way we vote, how we choose to live to some extent.
I was going to say the way we behave.
The way we behave and what policies we support. I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm running for a public transit office, is because I see that as a next step in my role fighting climate change. But that's how we started. Of course, since then, we're like, yes, but also there are so many movements. Pick something. But that was our goal. So it's always been grounded in that idea of we need to be active in these issues that affect us and everybody else.
Well, whether it's the connectivity of climate change, whether it's heroes at the forefront, or whether it's, gathering and creating a sense of belonging, you both are doing such tremendous work. And I know that people are really galvanizing around it and being inspired for sure. Barnali and Anirvan, thank you so much for joining me today. What a treat, and wishing you all the best for all the continued work that you're doing.
Thanks so much.
You're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. Stay tuned.